Welcome back. Since last time you traced Ibn Taymiyyah's opening volleys against the foundations of kalam in volume 1, and today in volume 2 we enter the thorniest debates like al-ʿulū, the divine highness, al-istiwa, al-hadd, the limit, al-jism, the body, and al-Highness, the spatial occupation, and al-jihah, the direction, and of course his engagements with al-Razi and Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Taymiyyah begins by reiterating the Salafi epistemic framework, means divine attributes are affirmed as real without engaging in takyif or inquiring into the modality or tamthil, likening to the creation. So this is foundational because the speculative kalam starts with the abstract metaphysical premises and then measured revealed descriptions against them. So Ibn Taymiyyah begins his first chapter by saying, فَصْلٌ لَا يُقَالْ فِي صِفَاتِ اللَّهِ كَيْفٍ ولا في أفعاله لما، أي لا يسأل عن الكيفية في الصفات كما لا يسأل عن العلة في أفعاله، لأن الله سبحانه أعلم بنفسه وأفعاله وقد بين ما شاء منها لعباده. Means it isn't to be said regarding the attributes of Allah how, not regarding his actions why. For Allah clarified is He knows best His own essence, His own action, and He has clarified of them to His servants whatever He will. So this headline sentence distills a Salafi epistemic role, means affirm what Allah has affirmed for Himself without takyif or the specifying the modality, and without ta'leel or the probing divine acts for causal need. Methodologically, this places a guardrail language about how God is true but not exhaustive. It's meaningful without being modelized by human categories. This undercuts kalām's habitual lead to Highness as a rational preconditions for assent. Here Ibn Taymiyyah invokes the aqidah, the creed, the principle that all inquiries into the divine essence beyond what is revealed are epistemically unsound. So the Quran itself models this approach. It affirms ar-Rahman al-Arshi istawa without offering a metaphysical schema. And asking how or the kayf presumes that God's nature can be comprehended through human categories. A presumption Ibn Taymiyyah treats as an epistemic arrogance. And the next chapter focuses on the refutation of the philosophers and divine wisdom. So the philosophers, particularly the peripatetics influenced by Aristotle, often denied the final causality or the ghaya in God's actions to avoid implying divine need. And ironically, some kalam theologians accepted this premise. And Ibn Taymiyyah asserts that وقال هؤلاء الأفعال لا يقصد بها غرض ولا غاية لأن هذا يوجب أن يكون الرب محتاجا إلى ذلك الغرض. وهذا ممتنع عليه سبحانه. Means the said acts are not intended for any purpose or end, for this would necessitate that the Lord be in need of that purpose, and this is impossible for Him, glorified is He. Ibn Taymiyyah reports and critiques the lines of the argument that deny final causes in divine actions to avoid implying need. He counters purpose equals to need, and denying divine wisdom evacuates the creation of teleology and collides with the Quranic assertion that Allah acts bil-haqq and bil-hikmah. His larger movements restore teleology to theology without anthropomorphism. Divine action means divine action is purposive by perfection, not by deficiency. So Ibn Taymiyyah distinguishes between ihtiyaj or the need and hikmah, the wisdom. So God's purposeful action is not due to need but due to perfection. To deny purpose is to attribute frivolity to divine action, and that contradicts the verse, the Quranic ayah, وَمَا خَلَقْنَا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا لَعِبِينَ. And we didn't create the heavens and the earth and everything between them in play or without purpose. So this aligns him with the Quranic teleology against both Aristotelian necessity and kalam voluntarism. And the third chapter more centered on the critique of Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Rushd attempts to universalize certain necessary truths derived from the Aristotelian logic, and Ibn Taymiyyah argues that these apply to the contingent beings only. And Ibn Taymiyyah said, الوجه الثالث ما ذكره ابن رشد من الأمور الضرورية إنما يجي في حق المخلوق دون الخالق. Means the third point, what Ibn Rushd mentions regarding the necessary matters, applies to the created and not to the created. So here he severs the Aristotelian necessity from the divine case. The creator's necessary being is sui generis. You cannot put over creaturely categories of causation, motion, or spatial entailment and staple them onto the divine. This rebukes the ingenuity often smuggled into the perpetuating necessity. It also recalibrates the analogy قياس الغيب على الشاهد, or the analogy from the unseen to the seen, that must be used cautiously and not as a bulldozer. This is the part of the Ibn Taymiyyah's larger critique of applying قياس الغيب على الشاهد, or the analogy from unseen to seen indiscriminately. The divine is wajib al-wujud in a sui generis sense, and that transcends the constraint of the temporality, potentiality, and spatial extension that apply to creatures. And the chapter 4 engages with Fakhruddin al-Razi and God's non-speciality. Al-Razi argues that God is not inside the world nor outside it. لا داخل العلم ولا خارجه. However, Ibn Taymiyyah dismantled this by appealing to revelation, consensus, and innate rationality. He asserts that أن رؤية الله ثابتة بالقرآن وبالسنة المتواترة وباتفاق السلف والأئمة ومن المعلوم عقلا أن المرئي لا يكون إلا في جهة من الرأي. Means that the vision of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is established by the Quran, man's transmitted sunnah, and the consensus of the salaf and imams, and it is rationally known that the things seen must be in a direction relative to the seer. So here two moves stand out. Number one, Ibn Taymiyyah refutes the formula that neither inside nor outside, لا داخل العلم ولا خارجه, as an empty universal negation that dissolves real existence into abstraction. And further, he links ru'yah, the beatific vision, to rational datum. Seeing entails a relational orientation of the jiha, not as a special containment of God, but as a relation between seen and seer. He underscores that the ru'yah is scripturally certain and rationally coherent, while ta'til, the stripping attributes, creates the contradictions. So Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't posit jiha as a limitation, but as an affirmation of the real existence and relationality. So the ru'yah, the beatific vision, affirmed in the Quran, ila rabbiha nadira, looking at the Lord. It entails a relation between the seer and seen, which in created cognition requires the jiha or the direction. And the chapter 5 debates al-had, or the limit. So some narration from Salaf affirm a limit for God while others deny it. And Ibn Taymiyyah cites from Al-Khallal's book As-Sunnah, quoting Imam Ahmad and denying that servants can comprehend any limit or extremity for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Ibn Taymiyyah reconciles these by distinguishing between ontological separation and human comprehension. As Ibn Taymiyyah quoted from the Quran, وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِهِ عِلْمًا, and they do not encompass him in knowledge. So Ibn Taymiyyah explores the apparent tension between affirming ontological distinction that God is not an indeterminate abstraction and denying encompassing knowledge of his essence. وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِهِ عِلْمًا. He shows that Salaf discourse is two-tiered. It guards transcendence without collapsing into either corporealism or the pure negation. So the limit talk marks the real distinction, while the denial of comprehension marks transcendence. So affirming a limit means affirming that God is not indeterminate or merged with the creation. And denial means rejecting the idea that humans can measure or fully comprehend the limit. And the chapter 6 explores the influence of the Greek thoughts. So Ibn Taymiyyah treats the Greco-Arabic translation movement as a watershed. Aristotelian logic and metaphysics retemplatized the inquiry, spawning the sectarian drift and semantic inflation. He urges a return to the Quranic argumentation where terms are public, axiological, and experiential, not hyper-abstract. He also critiques the chaotic use of the qiyas al-ghayb among the theologians and philosophers alike. So the Greco-Arabic translation movement introduced the foreign metaphysics, which Kalam adopted, moving away from the Quranic reasoning rooted in ayat and fiṭrah. So Ibn Taymiyyah treats this as the historical turning point that produced the epistemic and sectarian fragmentation. And he dedicated the chapter 7 to discuss the Salafi epistemology and fitrah. So he asserts that al-fitratu ad-daruriyya tahkimu bi-anna al-mawjud la yakunu illa qa'iman bi-nafsihi aw qa'iman bi-ghayrihi min ghayri at-tafriq bayna wajib wa mumkin. So it means that innate necessary disposition judges that an existence can only be self-subsisting or the subsisting through another, without differentiating between the necessary and the contingent. So here he re-anchors the metaphysics in pre-theoretical cognition. This is not anti-reason, it is proto-reason. By retrieving fitrah as epistemic bedrock, Ibn Taymiyyah both stabilizes language about God and rebukes the skepticism. If even basic ontological contrasts, qaim bi nafsihi or qaim bi ghayrihi, collapse, knowledge itself unravels or unfolds. And from here he argues that al-ʿulū and al-istiwa are coherent and scriptural, and denial breeds the category mistakes. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, fitrah is a form of pre-discursive knowledge, and corrupting it through philosophical abstraction leads to the sophistry. His entire theological method is built on aligning revelation with the fitrah in sound reason. So if we talk about what the volume 2 is really doing, and in this regard the first observation is that it focuses on reframing the metaphysical language. Volume 2 shows that many kalam negations, no inside, no outside, no above, no below, functions as the universal quantifier tricks that erase the reality to be described. And Ibn Taymiyyah replaces this with a measured affirmation. Affirm what revelation affirms, then deny the equivalence with the creation at the level of modality, not of meaning. And the second, it focuses on teleology without anthropomorphism. He restores the hikmah to divine action, and it poses both peripatetic impersonalism and the voluntarist reduction. And the result is a theism where ends and wisdom are intrinsic to perfection and not signs of need. And third, it seems that it's more concerned about regulating analogy or the qiyas. So against Ibn Rushd, he blocks the univocal transfer of the creationally necessities to God. It insisted on controlled analogy and revelation, and this limits both hyperliteralism and hypernegation. And the fourth, he highlights the ru'yah and jihah as relational, not containing. He defends ru'yah with textual certainty and rational relationality. So in fact, seeing entails the orientation without implying the containment or the spatial circumscription of the divine. So this deflates the standard objection that jihah or the direction implies the corporeality. And the fifth, he took fiṭrah as epistemic ground. By building from fiṭrah, he secures the common sense ontologies, means self-subsisting versus dependent being, and then aligns the naql plus aql instead of pitching them against each other. This recenters the Quranic rationality against logistic overreach. And finally, he highlights the documentary Salafism, not innovation. So the use of Darmi or al-Khalal and the reports attached to Imam Muhammad shows he's arguing from inheritance, not novelty, and especially regarding the al-ʿulū or the al-istiwa, and then non-incompassibility of the divine essence. So in fact, volume 2 of Bayan Talbīs al-Jahmiyyah advances a robust theological defense of the divine attributes, particularly Highness or al-ʿulū, and the establishment over the throne al-istiwa against the spectrum of negationist strategies prevalent in the kalam and peripatetic philosophy. So Ibn Taymiyyah exposes the performative vacuum of the universal negation, neither inside the world nor outside it. And it restores the teleology to divine action without imputing need, and confines analogy to the boundaries dictated by the revelation. He vindicates the beatific vision of the ru'yah through textual certainty and rational relationality without a special containment, and he anchors the metaphysical discourse in fiṭrah as primordial, non-sophistical cognition. Moreover, the documentary trail to early Sunni sources positions his stance as inheritance rather than innovation. And in doing so, volume 2 presents a constructive alternative to Hellenistic metaphysics, one that integrates the scriptural clarity, rational coherence, and the cognitive realism of the early community. So we can say the volume 2 of the Bayan Talbīs al-Jahmiyyah is a rigorous theological manifesto affirming the Salafi understanding of the divine attributes against the speculative negation of the jahamiyyah, mutakallimun, and philosophers. Ibn Taymiyyah defends God's ulu, istiwa, had, and jihah with a balanced synthesis of the naql plus aql, arguing that the denial of these attributes either collapses into the contradiction or undermines the meaningful theism. He confronts Ibn Rushd's Aristotelianism, al-Razi's non-specialism, and the philosopher's denial of the divine teleology, and showing how each deviates from the prophetic model. His methods elevates the fiṭrah as a universal epistemic ground, harmonizing it with the revealed truth and rejecting the post-Hellenistic speculative frameworks that alienated the Islamic theology from its original clarity. So today we discussed how Ibn Taymiyyah rebuilt a theology where revelation, reason, and fiṭrah move together. And in our next episode, we'll continue with volume 3, tracking how these debates unfold further, especially where issues of the language, predication, and causality get even more intricate.